The Soul Eater did not hum, it groaned. It was a sound High Overlord Vrak had heard since the day he was hatched in the dark, damp nurseries of the Krell throne world. To his people, the sound was the Architect's breath, a sacred vibration that proved the ship was alive, sustained by the divine will of the precursors who had abandoned the galaxy 10,000 years prior. To Vrak, sitting atop his obsidian throne, the groan was a reminder of his heritage. He didn't notice the way the floor plates vibrated with a jagged, uneven frequency that rattled his teeth. He didn't notice the smell of ionized ozone and stagnant, recycled sweat that clung to the air like a physical weight. In the Krell hegemony, technology was not understood, it was inherited. Their starships were relics, thawed tech treasures found in the ruins of the great architects. The Krell knew which buttons summoned the star map, and which levers unleashed the plasma cannons, but the why was a mystery guarded by the priesthood of the core. If a light flickered out, it was a trial of darkness. If a cooling fan ceased, it was a fast of the wind. The Krell did not repair. They performed rituals of appeasement. They offered energy crystals to the fusion reactors and sang hymns to the atmospheric scrubbers. When a ship finally died, collapsing into a cold, airless tomb, it was simply accepted as the Architect's silence. Entropy was the only true religion in the galaxy. The Aethel, the oldest and proudest of the species, watched the stars dim with a serene, suicidal grace. Across the spans of the Milky Way, the great machines were stopping. Dyson Spheres were clogging with millions of years of solar soot. Stargates were drifting out of alignment, and the knowledge of how to wind the clock was gone. Then from the outer rim came the humans. They arrived in ships that looked like floating factories, blocky, unpainted, and scarred by weld lines. They didn't have the translucent glowing hulls of the Aethel or the obsidian spikes of the Krell. They had external piping, modular hatches, and something the rest of the galaxy hadn't seen in millennia: visible, accessible circuitry. The Galactic Council mocked them. They called them the janitors. They laughed at the humans' obsession with standardized parts and maintenance schedules. To the Council, the humans were children playing with sticks in the ruins of a palace. The first contact didn't happen with a fleet, but with a plumbing crisis. An Aethel diplomatic spire had suffered a thirst of the spirit, a clogged primary water intake that the high priests had been praying over for 3 weeks. When a human service tug last resort arrived, High Priestess Alara expected a temple to a new god of logic. Instead, she found a man named Miller lying on his back under a leaking hydraulic line, covered in a viscous black fluid he called Great a Goop. "Watch your step, lady," Miller grunted, wrestling with a heavy rusted iron object with a moving jaw. "Is that a relic?" Alara asked, her voice trembling. "A sacred focus for your intent." Miller slid out, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He looked at the heavy iron tool. "That? It's a 16-inch pipe wrench. It's not a relic, it's a lever. Physics doesn't care if you pray to it, it just cares about torque." He didn't offer a chant, he just hit the pipe with a hammer. To Alara, this was percussive heresy. To Miller, it was just encouraging the gaskets. Within 10 minutes, the sacred water was flowing. It was this fundamental lack of awe that terrified the Council. The humans treated the divine unknown like a used mining barge. This was the terrifying reality of the human species. They had no awe. To the rest of the galaxy, the god tech of the architects was a series of miracles that demanded obedience. To the humans, it was just plumbing that hadn't been touched in too long. The humans walked through the most sacred ruins of the galaxy, with the bored expressions of people looking for a fuse box. While the Krell spent decades training their techno-paladins to interpret the flickering lights of an ancient stargate, a human technician would walk up, kick the base of the pedestal, and mutter something about corroded ground wires. They brought tools that were terrifyingly analog. In a galaxy of phase shifters and Neuralink interfaces, the humans used ratchets that made a sharp clicking sound, the sound of mechanical certainty. They used duct tape, a silver adhesive fabric that they claimed could fix anything from a cracked coffee mug to a pressurized hull breach. "You use glue?" Overlord Vrak had once asked a human engineer during a diplomatic summit. "To hold together the skin of a starship?" "It's not just glue, buddy," the engineer had replied, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "It's 200 miles per hour tape. If it moves and it shouldn't, we tape it. If it doesn't move and it should, we hit it with the WD-40. It's not rocket science. Well, actually, it is rocket science, but that's the easy part. The hard part is finding a 10mm socket when you actually need one." This nonchalance was a psychological weapon the humans didn't even know they were wielding. They treated the apocalypse-class technology of the Krell as fixer-uppers. When a Krell warlord threatened them with a void scythe cannon, the humans didn't cower. They just looked at the weapon's cooling vents and told the warlord he was going to blow his own hand off if he didn't replace the thermal paste on the heat sinks. They weren't being brave. They were being practical. And to a galaxy built on the fear of the unknown, a species that treated the divine unknown as a to-do list, was the most frightening thing in the universe. High Priestess Elara of the Aethel announced. Her voice was thin, translated through a flickering holographic matrix that suffered from a persistent harmonic distortion. Vrak leaned forward, his claws scraping the obsidian of his throne. "Vesper? That system is a graveyard. The Dyson swarm there has been cold for 3,000 years. The planets are ice balls. Let the janitors freeze in the dark." "They aren't freezing, Vrak," Elara whispered. She flickered, her image replaced by a long-range telescopic view of Vesper Prime. Vrak's yellow eyes widened. The star, once a dull, smothered ember, was brilliant. The Dyson swarm, millions of individual solar collector panels, was no longer a chaotic cloud of debris. The panels were aligned in a perfect rotating geometry, tracking the star's coronal loops with the precision of a master-crafted timepiece. "They didn't just find a way to live there," Elara continued, her voice trembling. "They serviced it. Our probes show they've been scraping the calcium-carbon buildup off the collector lenses for 6 months. They've replaced the ancient, crystallized superconducting cables with copper-threaded fiber. Vrak, they are treating the architect's sacred relics like a used mining barge." "They are blasphemers," Vrak growled, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The Krell hegemony was starving. Their own Dyson swarm at the throne world was failing, its output dropping by 1% every decade. If the humans had the secret to waking the dead stars, the Krell would not ask for it. They would take it. "Prepare the war arcs," Vrak commanded his bridge crew. "We will go to Vesper. We will show these janitors that the architect's treasures belong to those with the strength to hold them." The Krell fleet consisted of 800 vessels, a formidable armada of jagged iron and ancient plasma. But as they entered hyperspace, the reality of their sacred status was evident. On the Soul Eater, the radiation shielding on the starboard side had been leaking for 2 centuries. The crew on those decks were mutated, their scales pale and sloughing off, but they were honored as the marked of the core. Vrak himself felt the constant low-grade fever of radiation sickness, a condition he accepted as the burden of command. They moved through the void like a caravan of ghosts. Every jump was a gamble. Every time the warp drive spun up, there was a 20% chance a ship wouldn't emerge on the other side. To the Krell, this was the architect's tithe. To an engineer, it was a catastrophic failure of the magnetic containment rings. When they dropped out of warp at the edge of the Vesper system, they expected to see a terrified human fleet, a collection of tin cans and transport tugs. Instead, they saw a system that hummed with industrial intent. The space around the Dyson swarm was filled with service hubs, modular stations that looked like giant toolboxes. And then there were the human ships, 200 of them. They weren't larger than the Krell war arcs, but they were clean. There was no exhaust trail, no leaking radiation, no jagged edges. They were built for a single purpose: to keep the universe running. A transmission hit the Soul Eater's bridge. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a 400-page PDF titled Vesper System, Navigation and Safety Protocol version 4.2. "Attention incoming vessels," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, tired, professional, and carrying the weight of a person who had spent 30 hours straight looking at a diagnostic screen. "This is Chief Engineer Sarah Jenkins of the Vesper Maintenance District. You are currently in violation of 34 local safety codes. Your flagship is trailing a radioactive plume that is contaminating our solar collectors. Please shut down your engines and prepare to be towed to a decontamination berth. If you do not comply, we will be forced to begin an emergency system audit." Vrak stood, his ceremonial cloak of Xanfer billowing. "I am High Overlord Vrak. I do not submit to audits. I am the master of the Iron Stars. Fire all forward batteries. Turn their service hubs to slag." The Krell fleet unleashed their plasma. 800 ships fired simultaneously, a wall of white-hot energy that should have vaporized anything in its path. But the humans didn't raise shields. They didn't scramble fighters. Sarah Jenkins sighed over the comms. The sound was audible to every Krell on the bridge. It was the sound of a woman who had just seen someone track mud onto a freshly mopped floor. "God damn it! Do you have any idea how much work it is to recalibrate those sensors after a plasma discharge? Fine. Initiating magnetic scrub." The Dyson swarm panels didn't just sit there. They moved. They angled themselves with a sudden coordinated grace. The humans weren't using the star for power anymore. They were using the star as a magnet. The Vesper star's magnetic field was harnessed, amplified through the swarm, and focused into a localized gravitational funnel. The Krell plasma bolts composed of ionized gas were caught in the grip of a force they couldn't resist. Instead of hitting the human ships, the plasma was folded into the space between them. Vrak watched in horror as his fleet's combined firepower was bent, twisted, and sucked into the Dyson panels like water into a drain. "Thanks for the boost," Sarah's voice crackled. "We were running a bit low on the day shift capacitor bank. That volley just powered our orbital welders for a month. Now, let's talk about your targeting systems." Vrak roared for a second volley, but the Soul Eater groaned a new, terrifying sound. The obsidian consoles on the bridge turned a bright, clinical blue. "My lord!" The tactical priest screamed, frantically pressing buttons that no longer responded. "The targeting computers! They are talking back!" Vrak demanded. "The humans. They sent a signal back through our firing telemetry. It wasn't a virus. It was a firmware patch. The screen says our fire control software is dangerously inefficient and archaic. It has initiated a mandatory system optimization." Across the 800 Krell ships, the god tech fell silent. The ancient crystallized logic cores which the Krell had worshipped for millennia were being overwritten by a human script that prioritized logic over faith. Vrak looked at his screen. A spinning icon of a small cartoon human holding a wrench appeared. Underneath it, the words "Optimizing Sacred Targeting Algorithms, 15% complete. Do not power off your vessel or the core." They think they can treat us like broken appliances? They have forgotten who we are. We are the heirs to the apocalypse. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath his throne and pulled out a glass sphere containing a pulsing violet light. This was the harbinger of ruin, a precursor weapon so powerful that the Krell had only used it twice in 10 centuries. It was a singularity generator, designed to collapse the space-time fabric around a target, dragging it into a localized black hole. "If they will not let us fire our cannons, we will use the Architect's End," Vrak roared. He crushed the glass sphere into a recessed socket on his throne. A deep subsonic hum vibrated through the hull. Outside, the space in front of the Soul Eater began to distort. The stars stretched and warped as a tiny pitch-black dot appeared, growing at an exponential rate. The human ships, caught in the mounting gravitational shear, began to drift toward the void. Vrak laughed. "Behold, can you fix a hole in reality, janitor?" On the human flagship, the work order, Sarah Jenkins didn't scream. She didn't even drop her coffee. She glanced at a bank of sensors, that would have looked primitive to any other race. While the Krell relied on neural matrix screens that interpreted the user's emotions, Sarah's console was a wall of brass-rimmed analog needles and cathode ray tube CRT monitors. She liked the CRTs. They didn't care about emotional resonance, they just showed electron paths. "Hey, Mark," Sarah said, leaning back in her heavy, squeaky leather chair. "Look at the needle on the grav meter. It's pinning. Is that a precursor Mark 7 singularity cell?" A man in a stained jumpsuit looked over a stack of paper printouts. "Yep, Mark 7, the one with the unstable chronon containment rings." "Those pieces of junk?" Sarah scoffed. "God, those things were recalled 5,000 years ago. I think there was a class action lawsuit across 3 galaxies over those seals. They leak like a sieve." She tapped a glass-covered dial with her fingernail. The needle was vibrating violently in the red zone. "Vrack, you're lucky you didn't turn your whole crew into 5-year-olds the moment you cracked the glass. That seal is a fire hazard." Vrack's laughter faltered. "It is the harbinger of ruin, your doom." "No, it's a localized space-time leak," Sarah snapped, her patience finally ending. "Mark, grab the magnetic cork from the basement, the heavy-duty one we used for the leak in the Centauri Stargate." Vrack watched as a single human tugboat, a ship that looked like a flying brick with a crane arm detached from the swarm. It didn't flee. It accelerated directly toward the growing black hole. On the tugboat, the sensors weren't glowing crystals. They were physical metal rods that extended into the vacuum, measuring the pull of the singularity by how much they bent. "Aligning the flange," the tug pilot muttered. The tugboat fired a beam of high-density polarized gravitons. A massive, glowing ring of blue energy expanded from the tug, surrounding the singularity. It wasn't a magical spell. It was a physical containment gasket. "Capping the leak now," Sarah muttered, looking at her CRT. The green line on the monitor stabilized into a flat, boring wave. "Man, the paperwork for a localized space-time rupture is going to be a nightmare. I'm going to have to file a hazardous materials report for the whole system." The blue ring contracted. The black hole, the terrifying harbinger of ruin, didn't explode. It didn't consume the system. It simply stopped. It shrank back into a tiny, harmless dot, and then vanished with a sound like a light bulb popping. "There," Sarah said, her voice sounding muffled as she took a loud slurp of her coffee. "Contained. We'll pick up the remnant particles later with a vacuum skimmer. Now, where was I? Oh, right, your ship is a dumpster fire. We're moving to stage 3. The Krell fleet was dead in the water, trapped in a reboot cycle, and their ultimate weapon had been treated like a leaky faucet. That was when the drones arrived. They weren't boarding pods filled with Marines. They were maintenance drones, spider-like machines equipped with high-pressure welders, diamond-tipped drills, and industrial-grade epoxy sprayers. They didn't try to blow the airlocks. They went for the injuries. On the Soul Eater, the drones latched onto the deck. 12 hull breached the sacred architect's mark. Vrack watched through the bridge cameras as the drones began to work. They didn't perform a ritual. They didn't sing hymns. They used plasma cutters to trim away the jagged, rusted edges of the hull. They sprayed a foaming, self-sealing polymer into the gaps. They welded a titanium alloy plate over the hole with a speed and precision that made Vrack's stomach churn. "They're welding our gun ports shut," a commander from another ship shrieked over the short-range comms. "They're reinforcing our structural struts. They're installing external cooling fans on our reactors. They say our heat bleed is environmentally irresponsible." Vrack realized with a cold, sinking feeling that the humans weren't fighting a war. They were performing an unauthorized renovation. Vrack expected the Soul Eater to reboot into its familiar state, the groan, the flickering lights, the smell of ozone. Instead, the ship woke up with a silent, terrifying efficiency. The bridge lights didn't flicker. They glowed with a steady, daylight-balanced warmth. The air didn't smell like sweat. It smelled of nothing, perfectly filtered, crisp and clean. And the groan was gone. The engines were so quiet, Vrak thought they were dead, until he looked at the power readings. The reactor was operating at 98% efficiency. It had never been above 40% in his lifetime. Vrak? Sarah Jenkins' face appeared on the main screen. She looked like she had finally had a cup of coffee. Listen, we finished the emergency stabilization. Your fleet was a walking disaster area. We've patched the primary leaks, stabilized your containment rings, and installed a basic diagnostic suite so you stop blowing yourselves up. No charge for the first hour. But the materials cost is going to be a bit steep. Vrak gripped the arms of his throne, but he felt different. His head was clear. The persistent fever of radiation sickness was receding as the scrubbers pulled the toxins from the air. He looked at his crew. They weren't praying. They were staring at their consoles, eyes wide with the shock of seeing data that was actually accurate. You fixed us, Vrak whispered. We performed a necessary maintenance overhaul, Sarah corrected him. Vrak, you can't lead a war if your soldiers realize they've been living in a dumpster for 1,000 years. Look at your men. Really, look at them. Vrak looked. One of his elite guards had removed his helmet. He was drinking water from a newly repaired dispenser water that was clear, cold, and sparkling. The guard was weeping. He had never tasted water that didn't have the metallic tang of rust. The war is over, Vrak, Sarah said. Not because we destroyed your ships, but because we destroyed your religion. Your god tech isn't divine. It's just old, and it's poorly maintained. The Krell hegemony did not surrender in the traditional sense. There was no treaty signed in blood. Instead, there was a series of service contracts. Humanity's superpower wasn't their ability to kill. It was their ability to enable, in a galaxy that had been slowing down for 10,000 years, the humans were the only ones who knew how to push the start button. Within a year, the janitors were the most powerful force in the galaxy, not because they had the biggest guns, but because they held the keys to the stargates. If a species was hostile, the humans didn't invade. They simply declared their systems a safety hazard and shut down the trade routes for maintenance. Vrak transitioned from High Overlord to High Supervisor of the Construction Corps. He found that there was more glory in the successful reignition of a Dyson Sphere than there ever was in the bombardment of a planet. He traded his obsidian throne for a high-back ergonomic chair and his ritual blade for a multi-tool. He was standing on the bridge of the Soul Eater, now the Soul Repairer, watching a human crew teach Krell, recruits, how to align a warp ring. You know, Vrak said to Sarah Jenkins, who was visiting the ship for a quarterly inspection, I used to think the architects left us because we were unworthy of their power. Sarah looked up from her clipboard, adjusted her glasses, and smiled. Maybe. Or maybe they just got tired of being the only ones who knew how to change the oil. Everyone needs a vacation, Vrak. Even the guys who built the universe. Vrak looked out at the Vesper star, its light steady and true, no longer choked by the soot of neglect. He realized then that the greatest threat to a galaxy wasn't war, or plague, or even death. It was a broken filter. And as long as there were humans with a sense of duty and a sturdy wrench, the light would never go out. 10 years later, the Galactic Council had been renamed. It was now the Office of Systems and Infrastructure. The Aethel had stopped their serene suicide and were now obsessed with historical restoration. The Zan were no longer scavengers. They were the galaxy's primary manufacturers of standardized hex bolts. The Great Repair was not finished. It would never be finished, but the silence was gone. The galaxy hummed. It was a low, constant, healthy sound. It was the sound of 1 trillion machines working as they were intended to work. Ambassador Alara, her holographic form now crisp and 8K resolution, thanks to a human-built projector, addressed the assembly. We once worshipped the architects as gods, she said. We spent millennia looking for their footprints in the dust, hoping they would return and fix what we had broken. We were a galaxy of children, crying in the dark because the lights went out. She looked at the human delegation, a group of men and women in practical jumpsuits, half of them covered in grease, all of them looking like they desperately needed a nap. "The humans taught us that the architects didn't want our worship," Elara continued. "They wanted our help. They didn't leave us a museum to be admired. They left us a home to be maintained, and in the end, we learned the most important lesson of existence." She paused, a small knowing smile on her face. "The universe doesn't run on magic. It runs on effort. And as long as there is someone willing to get their hands dirty, the dark will never win." In the back of the hall, Sarah Jenkins yawned, checked her watch, and tapped a colleague on the shoulder. "All right, that's the speech done. Let's get to the Centauri sector. I heard their Stargate is making a clicking sound, and that usually means a faulty bearing." The humans left the hall, their heavy boots clunking on the polished floor. They didn't look like heroes. They didn't look like legends. They just looked like people with work to do. And in a galaxy that had finally learned how to wind its own clock, that was more than enough.